Great. Welcome to Effect Office Hours number 5. And yeah, we're going to do what we do every Effect Office Hours now, apparently. We sort of are slowly coalescing into some predictable behavior, which seems to be that we ramble a bit and then take call-ins for questions. Oh, and it looks like someone even has a reproducer today, which is amazing. Yeah, for the future, if anyone doesn't have a question, ideally you could join with a Riverside link, even though we are multicasting, I think, to some number of streaming platforms. I'm not even sure how many, but we can't look at all the windows everywhere or we'd go mad. So the Riverside link, which is in the Discord and on the official Luma event, should bring you to a chat that we will be reading, that I will be reading. And you can also call in from the web there. And if you have a question prepared, that would be great. If it's just a sort of a conceptual high-level question, you don't need anything else besides your question. But if it's something that you want us to take a look at some code, if you want to prepare something for next time ahead of time, a gist, or on the Effect website, there's a little playground that Maxwell made. Share a link to that, and we can take a look at that live. For bigger questions, if you have a really meaty question, if your company is using Effect and you have some problematic code that you want to go over, maybe send that ahead of time and we can take a look and then work through it together. But yeah, open to suggestions too. We're still figuring this out. In the meantime, I did prepare a little bit of a mini presentation thing from last time where we talked a little bit about layers. And I wanted to get into a bit of how they actually are implemented. I thought that might be fun. Sort of look at two things. One, maybe perhaps an idiomatic way of structuring our app to talk about layers and dependency injection with a mini example that I threw together. Not the greatest example, but whatever. This is office hours. It isn't some a conference talk. So apologies for any rough edges. And then we can sort of live code, hopefully successfully, our way through building the mechanisms, the internal workings of how layers work a little bit, the context piece. Hello, Elot. So without further ado, if you want to call in, feel free to call in and I'll get to you maybe after this little presentation, but it should queue you up, or you can wait until I'm done and then call in. And if we have multiple callers, I'll just do them in order. So yeah, does that sound good, Maxwell?
Sounds great. Very nice summary.
Wow, thank you. And also tomorrow, from, I believe, 9 a.m. to some mysterious endpoint, depending on how successfully it goes, I will be chatting with Tej, the mononymous Tej, who I've seen on the internet. He just seems to be a lovely person and I just see him smiling in various videos. I don't watch too much Twitch or streaming, so I don't know him too well, but I believe he is in the cadre, the coterie with who do you call him? The prime agent, the primary agent, as well as the DAX and all these other sort of friendly, open sourcey, YouTube-y characters, some sort of code avengers. So yes, there's love for Tej in the chat. That's good. I'm glad you're not warning me of his malevolence.
9 a.m. Eastern, Kit?
9 a.m. Eastern to potentially, he said he streams from 9 to 12. And if I want to go the distance, if I'm capable of going the distance, I don't know, my brain sort of turns to putty after about an hour in general, an hour and a half as well. But we'll see. I've been conditioning here with you, Maxwell, slowly adjusting to this lifestyle. Anyway, okay. So so that should be fun. I'm going to be talking to him about Effect in general, sort of just, I guess, showing him Effect from, pitching it, offering it humbly and hoping that he doesn't give it a thumbs down. Gladiator style, gladiatorial combat style. Gladiatorial. So yeah, hopefully he gives it a thumbs up and we go viral and get 100 likes. Make him do a live stream of reading the docs. Yeah, I've heard somebody reached out and said the docs were very well written and they enjoyed them, which is great. Even though I think we still want to improve them always. Okay, I'm sharing a screen here, and I think everyone can see it. And let's talk about this. So mini presentation, and then it looks like we have a call. from Tyler.earth. So I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible and then get to your call, Tyler, because I think we missed it at the end of last time because we had a bit of a queue, a call stack, if you will, a call queue, rather. Okay, let us begin. So first, I just want to show off something about, at a very high level, the benefits of organizing one's applications using layers and what the entry point of an application might potentially look like. Though I, as I mentioned, didn't get to put too much time into polishing this, but here is a little example. So we have some program, some application, and if you want to, you can use, I'm using accessors here. So I'm calling userservice.create to create a user, and then I'm alerting this user. So this isn't like a real application necessarily. It's just one piece of an application, but nonetheless, we're creating a user and then immediately alerting that user. And this program has a type. It returns void. It doesn't really return anything. And then it has a few dependencies, user service and alert service. And we have these dependencies because we called into these accessor functions that basically just grab a user service for you by yielding it and then delegating to it. Same with alert service. But these accessors can be used to sort of streamline this process if you happen to generate them. And we'll take a look at that in a moment. So yeah, it makes this example code. It's not great for real applications, and I'll explain why in a moment. But it makes doing these presentations a little terser vertically. Cool. So we create a user and then we alert them. And I'm going to run this code, and we'll see that it sends an email to kitlangton@gmail.com. Oops, it's my real email, but you could have guessed probably. And then that's not my real phone number. Welcome to the service. So alerting both sends an email and an SMS to this particular user, and it clearly grabbed somehow my email and my phone number because I didn't pass that along. I just passed in the user's ID. So something in alert services is reaching into maybe a database and getting that information back out. Now, I actually did receive a real email because it is connected to Resend, which is seems to be a popular internet email service. So how does this all work? Well, yes. Let's see. So first, our application needed these two things, user service and alert service. So I use this default implementation of alert service and this default implementation of user service. And these implementations had their own transitive dependencies. And so alert service, we can take a look at this in a moment, needed both an SMS service and an email provider. And by using the resend email provider, this had its own transitive dependencies. It needed a resend email client and a resend email config, which I proceeded to plop down here. Cool. And we can see that if I remove one of these things, we're going to get a compilation error telling us that we need ourselves an email config, unfortunately. So I'm going to add that back. And then basically the way that your application will look at the top level is you'll have your program, you'll have some big app layer that provides all of your program's dependencies, including transitive dependencies. You're constructing your dependency graph, and then at the end you run your program and provide it with all of its dependencies bundled up in that layer, and then running it with bun. So that's how that works. And if I chose a different email provider, I believe I have a layer provide. I think there's an email service .default. Or maybe it's .test layer. There we go. This also works because the test layer does not at all require any transitive dependencies, unlike the resend email provider. So just by picking a different email service here, we either don't get any errors and I can run this and it will not actually send me an email. It will pretend to send an email. Or I can swap it with a real email provider, and that has its own. We sort of unlocked additional dependencies that we'll have to provide, and so on and so forth. And the nice thing about this sort of composable, interlocking little Lego pieces, which are layers, is that I can go to this test file, and I can instead construct a test layer here, which provides a user service, an alert service, an email service, an SMS service, and a test SMS service, all these different things. And here I'm using this test layer and this test email layer, and I can write tests for my alert service that don't actually send any emails, and that don't actually send any SMSs. They instead will use these special test implementations that just gather all of the emails that you try to send into an internal array that we can then access and make assertions on. So these little special test variants of our implementations. I probably have started looking at this in a strange way. Let me go back to the main program. So there are two primary purposes of using layers and dependency injection. One is it gives you sort of a normative way of structuring your applications in a way that, for me at least, is very anxiety relieving. I don't need to worry about, okay, how shall I architect or structure my applications? It's basically a solved problem. I'm going to decompose it into various services, and then I'm going to construct those services in a very predictable, almost identical way using effect.service, which we'll take a look at now. So basically every component in my system, every service in my application will look something like this. We're going to use the effect.service class extended. So we're defining an alert service, and there's a bit of boilerplate here, but nonetheless, it's basically a template. In fact, I think it'll even be auto-completed. Matthias showed us that last week. But yeah, we're gonna follow this pattern. And then in here, this is like, just to give you some tips. With TypeScript and Effect in general, there is a bit of boilerplate. I think it's unavoidable due to the limitations of TypeScript. And Maxwell and Michael and everyone else did a lot of hard work to make it that boilerplate as minimal as possible. And it got better and better over time. For instance, this fancy generator function syntax, which is almost like async await syntax with some extra asterisks for good luck. But there are still some instances where you do not have a single source of truth, and you do need to repeat, for instance, alert service here a couple of times. And if TypeScript had metaprogramming, you wouldn't have to, but it's the best we can. So when reading the code and when working with Effect, you eventually sort of learn what is noise and what is signal. And luckily, there is increasingly less noise, and hopefully going into the future, there'll be less and less noise. But yeah, basically, you just read this. That line is, okay, you're creating an alert service, which is a service, and you ignore the rest. And then you sort of come down here and say, okay, what is this default implementation of the alert service? And yeah, so first what happens is you grab any dependencies that you want. So this implementation of alert service is sort of the live implementation, the production implementation in this case, is going to depend on an email service, an SMS service, and a user service. And it only has one public API method, which is to alert a user. And so it takes a user ID, which in this case is just a number, and some message that it wants, that it's going to alert the user with. And we can see what it does. So this is the implementation. We're going to get the user. There's the user from the user service. Then we're going to send that user an email to their email. And then we're going to send that user an SMS to their phone number. And I can probably parallelize these, but I'm not going to bother with that right now. So this service is very simple. And one interesting thing is that this is not a leaf node of our dependency graph. This depends on other services. And therefore, we're probably never going to want a test implementation of this alert service. You can just define it like this. It's almost pseudocode at this level. Yes, there's some extra syntax, but it's very high level. You sort of declare your dependencies, you pluck them out of the environment, and then you declare your interface using those dependencies. And what this gives you for free is, well, a tag that you can use to pluck this service out of the environment. And it also gives you a layer, sort of this default layer. So by alert service.default is basically generated from this effect that you give here. And it's going to have three dependencies, anything that this effect depends on, which is user service, email service, and SMS service, because we're yielding them here using their respective tags. And we can see that the tag we get here, this alert service, where I'm using in our program, I'm using the accessor that we generate actually, which is generated by this, which allows us just to dot chain onto that identifier. And this is going to pluck the alert service out of the environment and then delegate to its alert method that we define. So it's a bit of stuff. It's not nothing. I just spoke there for a few minutes, sort of describing the structure of this service pattern. But that's it. And it sort of fractally repeats itself forever and always through every program you make. Like once you understand those few components, which is plucking dependencies at the top of this generator function, and then you can use them inside of the implementations and returning some implementation objects and whatever boilerplate needs to go here in the effect service class, you can do that for all of your services. Pretty much forever. In this code base, because I made some test implementations, I did some other little fancy things I was experimenting with, but that's basically it. We can go to user service, for instance, and it's the same thing. And this doesn't have any dependencies, actually, because I'm just doing a sort of an in-memory user service. In the real world, you probably would want one version that depends on a database, and then maybe another one that's a test implementation that is more like this, that just writes to a map or whatever. So in this case, I'm doing the same thing, creating a user service, giving it a name. And then in here, I am creating a user map. And then I'm defining these two methods, get and create, that look up a user in that map. If it doesn't exist, it throws an error. And then to create a user, I simply increment, I get some ID by getting the current size of the map, and then generating a new user and putting it into the map. So it's pretty trivial. SMS service, I believe, looks similarly. Yep. I did make a test layer here. So that's it. You can ignore this. This is kind of a little fancy. Maybe we can get to that if anyone's curious. I'm not even sure if that's a good thing. I was kind of just playing around. But nonetheless, this is where the SMS service, you might define a version, the default version that would depend on Twilio or some other texting provider. I don't really know. I haven't done that in a long time. Twilio is just, I hate their UI, but maybe there's a better thing. I'm going to pause there just for a moment. Did you happen to see any interesting questions, Maxwell, or is what I'm saying making any sense?
Yeah, maybe a few things from the questions. I saw a lot of stuff about accessors in the questions, about saying it's cool and stuff. And I agree, accessors are pretty cool with services, but you have to take pretty large care when you use accessors. In fact, most of the time, I would say accessors should be disabled unless you know what you're doing. And that's because it's like using accessors for services introduces that service as a dependency when you access it. So like if you were to do alert service.alert somewhere, that introduces alert service as a dependency. And so the reason why this could potentially cause a problem is because if you go back to alert service and inside your alert method, instead of using the access to user service, if you actually use SMS service, like capital SMS service.
Yeah, let me add accessors to this because I didn't do that before, and then I can. Yes. So what I did here was, we'll talk about why I did this. Is you basically grab all your dependencies outside of the implementations of your methods. But if I forgot to do that, if I have this accessor enabled and therefore I am tempted to do the following, I think, Maxwell, what you're going to say is this. Now this alert method has a dependency itself, which is very unfortunate. And why is this a bad thing? Well, that's because, let me go to where we call alert. Actually, why is that? I don't even know why this is failing. Missing SMS service. Because now instead of being sort of based on the particular implementation of alert service that we chose, where this layer sort of determines its transitive dependencies, now, before a program just depended on alert service and user service. And at a high level, if you look at this like pseudocode, that's really like, you can treat this as almost an abstract syntax tree for a program, and you get to pick the interpreter stack later on and swap them in and out. And as an abstract syntax tree, nowhere in this does it mention SMS service. That's an implementation detail of the implementation of alert service that you provide. But by leaking that dependency to alert, it propagates to your program, and now you need to provide an SMS service. And you can't swap in or choose. You're basically leaking an implementation detail, if that makes sense. Sorry, Max, I kind of took over from you. Is that kind of where you were going?
Yeah, no, that was a perfect illustration of why most of the time Mike and myself and Tim and pretty much all of us would advise against using accessors. There are only like a few cases where using accessors is fine. But it's like a very specific set of circumstances. And so like if you're new, especially into Effect, and like you're just getting used to using services and whatever, while it is much terser to use accessors, You could easily shoot yourself in the foot, like Kit just showed, by accidentally leaking requirements into the implementation of your service. So it's much better to do what Kit is doing here in the constructor for this layer or this service, where he's accessing all the dependencies he needs up front in kind of like I'll call it like the closure for this implementation. It's kind of, you can think of it like a closure in JavaScript terms. And then all we return from this constructor is the actual implementation we want to use. So the services are all accessed as part of this like quote unquote closure. We'll call it a constructor because that's really what it is. And then we return the actual implementation. So that in a test, we could return the same alert method with no dependencies, and that the test that we create for alert service may not access any dependencies in its constructor, right? So anyways, I just wanted to take a moment because I saw it coming up a little bit in chat. I wanted to take a moment and say, like, accessors, generally speaking, a non-advisable pattern only because it's really easy to leak dependencies in that circumstance.
Yes. And that reminds me. So, like, kind of an analogy here would be if you have an interface, like you don't, like, think of, if you're doing Java or something, the interface is just sort of this high level abstract thing. And then the implementations, the classes get to determine what dependencies you have. So maybe this would take in this live alert service would take in your SMS service. And then you could use it in the body of your alert or whatever. I'm just accepting this autocomplete, and it's probably all wacky. The alternative.
This is a really good. This is kind of a really good example of exactly what I'm getting at. Is in traditional oh god, I forget the name for this in programming. This is a programming concept. Constructor injection. It's not dependency injection, and constructor injection is not the right term either. There's an actual term for this.
Law of Demeter. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I think I actually have it in the effect documentation somewhere. I'll find it at some point. But this is a good example of like why of what we're basically saying here with the not using accessors. Instead of using accessors, which could potentially leak a dependency you need into your alert method, like in the class example, like leaking a dependency would be the equivalent of requiring one of these dependencies as a parameter to alert, right?
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's like this would be like if you did the SMS.service here and use the accessor. You're putting it into your interface rather than having it be sort of determined by the constructor parameter, which is kind of equivalent to what the dependencies of this final effect are here that you use to generate your service, which are outside of the implementations. So that's kind of an analogy there. Yeah, you want it as a constructor parameter or a constructor effect requirement rather than to show up in the signatures returned to your service. Because what you return here basically implicitly defines the interface of your alert service, which is kind of cool. It's sort of just it infers that, which is very nice. So yeah, that's a great detail, and I sort of So they're sort of annoying, right? They're useful mostly in two cases. One is teaching, because this was slightly less code. But really, this kind of code only exists maybe at the top level of your application. So it's not really too much of a problem to do something like this, because everything else in your program is going to be written mostly inside of service implementations. The only other code that isn't will be in tests. So it can be convenient. Yes, IOC. Internet of Critters. Yes. So inversion of control. Cool. So many fun gang of four patterns, or goth Ps, I should call it. TLAs forever. Using Next.js is really sort of, just briefly has shot my, tolerance for 3-letter acronyms, far over, like SSR and SSP and ISP and IPS and DNS, and it's so many. I'm going to explode. But yeah, so the only two places that it sort of is useful as accessors is in example code because it makes it terser, or sort of on the tin, it looks sexier, so people aren't like this is verbose. But really, it's only going to be here at the top level of your application, maybe, and inside of your tests, where I actually am
And
yielding test and SMS
actually,
service here,
there was
but here I'm not.
another question that came up earlier. I think it was Tom who asked it about layers as something that you like are executed that you run versus layers. I forget where the question was, but let me just scroll up really quick.
Oh, you mean like the launch thing?
I don't remember where it was asked, but there was layer versus layer as with parentheses, like constructing a layer versus having a static layer. And then I think there was another question about like layers being used to run the program. So like maybe we can tackle the latter thing first. So if you look at this program that Kit has here, in theory, like this could become a layer in and of itself, and then you could just layer.launch your program instead if you wanted to. You don't have to. Layer.launch would be a thing where you would typically do with like a server or something like that, because it kind of runs, it's a program that never stops. But like in a well-designed effect application, like a very well architected effect app, in theory your whole application can be a layer that's then executed. Like
Sure, like if I
or
wanted to, right, I could just have, a class, app service extends effect. I want to get his autocomplete. Oops. Effect.service. There we go. App service. So there's the autocomplete. Ooh, it even did all that stuff for us. And yeah, so here I can yield the two things and do this. Why is this sad? No overloads. Matching is not type. Never. I don't know what I've done here. Do I have to return some object? Because there's not really.
yeah.
I guess I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then so like the program at the effect itself runs the I don't know if I love effect.launch, but anyway, the idea is that then instead my program would
in
be
this case your program would actually be like you just building the layer. So it'd be like you'd layer.build, like you basically compose your application layer with your app service layer. It doesn't have to be that way. In most cases, you end up with like an effect that is your top level program, kind of your main, and then you do whatever else after that. But I think the point I was trying to make is that you theoretically could make your entire program a layer that you just build, and one of the layers has the side effect of like running your main program logic. But to get at the other question that was asked about layers as like a static value, like as a declared variable, versus layers as a like something that you construct with parentheses. I think we talked about this last time maybe, but the either one is fine. Layers are just a constructor for a service or a set of services, right? Generally speaking, when you have a layer that you call as a method, it's because your layer absolutely needs you to provide some parameters in order to construct that layer, which is fine under some circumstances, as long as you understand the implications of doing that. So if we scroll down, Kit, and you look at like your top level app layer here, you having a single resend email provider layer that's called as a method here is fine if it takes parameters. Does your resend email provider thingy take parameters?
Oh, you know what? That's a good question. It does. And I should probably pull this out. Yeah.
No, this is fine. Like this is a fine pattern if you wanted to do this, right? Like if instead of having a resend email client separate layer, like if you wanted to pack it all into one layer, you could pass the config to the email provider. It doesn't matter. The point I'm making is that sometimes you have layers that need parameters to create them. And to do like that's fine if you want to create a layer by calling a function. The foot gun here to be aware of is that when you're composing your layer graph together, if you provide the resend email provider dot layer like called as a function multiple times, like maybe you could duplicate this 2 or 3 times, this will create 3 instances of the resend email provider in your layer graph, because layers are memoized by like memory reference. Like they're memoized by reference. They're not memoized by like by anything else. So in order to fix this, usually layers are memoized, but like this is one example where you could potentially have a footgun where the layer gets constructed multiple times. To fix this, if you have a layer that requires you to like call a method to construct that layer, we generally recommend pulling that out and binding it to a variable. And you can see Kit like just showed an example of this. You can actually see the email provider getting constructed 3 separate times here. And to fix that, you would just pull this out into a variable so that you always get the same instance, so that we can properly memoize the layer.
Yes. Resend email layer. Just sad about the type here. Let me pull this out. Okay, cool. And now I'm going to run the same thing again now that I've pulled it out and do a constant, and we should only see once. So this is an example of referential transparency is not.
These are like not necessarily effect specific things. I mean, the fact that layers are memoized by reference is, but like understanding what by reference, understanding what reference equality is not necessarily an effect specific thing. But knowing that layers are memoized by reference is. So anyways, if you have a layer that like requires you to call a function to get back the layer, just make sure you're binding it to a variable so you're always getting the same reference. Otherwise, you could end up with multiple copies of that layer in your dependency graph.
Yeah, it's definitely an edge case or something to. It's definitely an advanced thing. Probably won't hit you. I think also. I think Mattia might be thinking about some kind of tooling to identify those situations, but I might be putting words in his brain. Anyway, I do want to back up just a minute because those are all important details. And like, yeah, the launch thing is fine. I mean, if launch seems at all confusing to you, just don't worry about it. Like the reason why I like layers is because of the regularity, because of the anxiety reduction. Like what I did here is before I had this stuff, right, yielding in this effect gen, and then I whatever called it. I now have extracted that logic into a run method and made an app layer. So like that those 2 yields are now in here. There's a run method. It follows the same pattern as alert service now. And then our program really here is just app service dot run or whatever. And at this point, you can do something like whatever effect dot flat map app service, and then yes, app service run. Maybe there's even a terser way of doing this. And that's the program.
Since you have accessors on here, this would be an example of where you could just do app service.run.
Oh my goodness, you're right. Boom. So that's our program now. So accessors can be nice to just remove that little bit here and there, but most of the time, your entire application, I would recommend, would look something like this, right? And you sort of get the pattern. You get to define a service, yield the services you need, and then return an implementation. And that's what alert service does, and that's what email service does, and that's what SMS service does, even though there's some other stuff I was playing with to be fancy. And that's basically it, over and over and over again. And that kind of regularity is just, I don't know, I love it. It's incredibly flexible as well. And there's some other little knobs you can tweak here. You can have scoped things here to like kick off background jobs. But for the most part, 90% of your applications, 95 maybe, will be this sort of fractally elaborated at every level.
There was a question about when folks should avoid or use the dependencies array in effect.service.
The dependencies array in effect.service. Yeah, that's a cool feature of this. Yeah, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it a little bit, but we can talk about it.
I can tell you what the thought process was. You can go over like what it is, and then I can tell you what our thought process was here.
Okay, cool. So let me go to examples. So yes, when you define this, we're defining like 3 things here. We're getting this tag, which allows us to yield that layer elsewhere and get its implementation. And if I look at the implementation, alert service dot alert, how do I even autocomplete this implementation? I didn't define that explicitly because it was implicitly defined by the shape that we returned from this effect value here, the shape of the object here. This alert function becomes our interface, which is abstract. But we simultaneously are sort of inferring that from a concrete, non-abstract implementation. So we might generate other layers for alert service that have the same interface, but do something different than what we're doing here, that just sort of don't actually, well, a better example would be the email service that wouldn't always call resend, but would just have an in-memory implementation or something like this. But in the cases that you do have a default service, okay, I said this before, I'll say it again because it's been a while and I'm trying to serialize my thoughts here, but not just as 95% of your program will follow this structure of this service pattern, and you won't have to get fancy about anything. Of these three steps of defining the service, yielding the services, returning the implementation. Also, 90% of your program probably only needs a live production implementation. Only the leaf nodes in your dependency graph are really going to need to be swapped most of the time, unless there's some special reason for this. Like, what's the point of providing a test implementation of this? If you want to test its behavior, you can provide test implementations of its dependencies and query their results. And then, whatever. It's people can get a little, I don't really like mocks. I don't know what people think about mocks and spies, but I feel like creating a spy version of this that sort of tracks how many times alert was called, that can get very tricky and can stray from the original implementation. Whereas if you let this just always be the implementation of alert service and make your assertions based on these sort of well-defined test implementations that live at your leaf nodes, I don't know. There's fewer weird ad hoc implementations of test things. When you have mocks, you sort of per test, you have these ad hoc implementations. You can make really nice test versions of your Leaf services, ship them with your libraries. We can ship them. Like, that's why there's test console and mock test terminal and all these other things. And they can give you everything you need to instrument your tests. But everywhere else in your application, at every other node in the layer graph, just have the default implementation. So that brings us to what is the dependency value. Well, if you just have one default implementation that mostly works all the time, then you can also have that this one has dependencies, right? There's user service, email service, and SMS service. And so in production, if this is the production implementation, you probably want some default dependencies, which would be, user service dot default, email service dot, I guess I don't have an email service default. I forgot. There's a test layer. So I could do test layer here, or I can construct some resend layer right in here and have, so in my main application, I could basically, I should probably pull this all out.
Well, maybe I could actually, I could interrupt you here for a sec
and
please. Say, like, this is actually a really good example because it exemplifies a few different things. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of cases where your production services are going to depend, your default implementation of your production services are going to depend on the default implementation of other services. In this case, user service.default and SMS service.default are predefined default layers that are being used in production. So we can actually pack those dependencies into alert service. So if you actually remove email service for a moment from the dependencies array here,
it'll work just partially as well.
Yeah, so we can say, okay, well, in production, we have this alert service. We have default implementations for user service and SMS service. So we can pack those into the dependencies array. But let's say, like, in production, maybe we swap between multiple different email providers, right? So we want to leave it out of the dependencies array. Well, now, if you go back to where we actually run the app, you can remove user service and SMS service, and as long as no other layers need them.
App service does in this case, but I could, if I wanted to, do the same thing here. Right. And therefore, voila. And in fact, now I don't even need to provide alert service because all our application now depends on is an app service. And the default implementation of this is now going to be basically all the dependencies inferred from this, which are alert service and user service, minus what you provide layers for here, which happens to be the exact intersection. And therefore, now this basically doesn't, it requires email service because this layer depends on email service. So that's actually
So
kind of cool now that I think about it.
this gets back to like the rationale we have for even having this dependencies array, which is another pattern that we recommend very heavily as folks lean more and more into services and start getting more comfortable with them, is something that Patrick's been talking about in chat here, which is local elimination of dependencies for your default layers generally leads to much cleaner like root level layers, right? So right now we have app service, which only depends on some email service, right? And so all we need to do is compose our app service with our email provider, whatever it might be, and we're done. The more you push your the more you locally eliminate dependencies for a given service, the cleaner higher up becomes, right? The higher up you move in your layer graph becomes cleaner and cleaner. So like you can imagine what Kit's doing here, right? We have this resend email layer that now we've composed together. Now, what if our resend module exposed this? Then the default layer for our whole application is what Kit has on line 44 here. It's literally just two layers that we merge together, or we provide one layer to the other, right? And so the more you locally eliminate dependencies, the more your root level layer, the thing that you actually provide to your final program, becomes just merging a bunch of layers together. And because of the fact that layer memoization works throughout the dependency graph, again, as long as you keep in mind that layers are memoized by reference, because layers are memoized throughout the dependency graph, regardless of where they are, they're only constructed once. You could have alert service.default and user service.default provided to 100 different services, and they're still only going to get constructed once. So this is why we often why this array even exists in effect.service, and why we recommend locally eliminating layers as much as possible, because it just ends up with a much easier to understand root level like layer for your application.
So yes, my skepticism has been dissolved live. Like I'm new to Effect. I don't know if anyone knows this. I've been using it for a few months now. I came from Zio, which is what Effect is based on. I worked on that for years. So like my knowledge of Effect is sort of broken by this weird alternate universe memory. And we didn't have this particular abstraction, and I really like it in general. And I was going to mention I was skeptical of dependencies because I didn't realize they could partially eliminate some of the dependencies, but not all of them. But yeah, that's a great example. And yeah, it solves the sort of other problem, that detail of the referential equality of layers if you just follow this pattern. So I take it back. That does, however, raise a question, which is an example.test. Now, because
I'm really
we're using
glad.
the
I
alert
think you're going
service.
to bring up. I think you're going to bring up something that I want to talk about now, which is go back to alert service for a moment.
Yeah.
So, in a scenario where you've locally eliminated your dependencies, let's say you have this alert service that in your application, and you, like Kit was talking about, you have this default implementation that's perfectly fine to use in your tests, right? This is perfectly fine. However, now you have a problem, right? Because you're injecting the default user service and the default SMS service as dependencies that are going to get packaged up into the default layer for alert service. Well, Kit, maybe underneath the class here, you could just type like alert service dot.
Oh, yes. So we have default and default without dependencies.
So whenever you have a dependencies array specified, you automatically get a second layer generated for you. That is the default without dependencies layer, which disregards the dependencies array and allows you to inject the implementations of the services you want to use, which can be very useful in tests, right? So in production, we can just use default and allow the default user service and default SMS service to be provided like we've specified, and we have to provide an email service. But in tests, we might want to ignore these default dependencies and instead provide those different things. And this is basically how you would achieve that. If you're fine with using the default implementation for your tests, and if you remove the dependencies array kit for a minute, you'll now see TypeScript raises an error because that layer, that default without dependencies layer, doesn't get generated for us anymore. So if you comment that back in for a sec, Kit, just like undo a couple of times.
Oh yeah,
The layer
yeah.
2. Yeah, so comment out dependencies, and you'll see that now we have an error. Defaults without dependencies doesn't exist when you don't have a dependencies array, because the only thing you could possibly have is a default layer.
Yeah, that's very, and obviously this is failing because it needs now all of the services because they're not partially provided. So now it'll go this way. That's super cool. I didn't know that, and I'm completely sold now and happy. It was not a fake. It was not scripted. Yeah, it's really impressive.
Definitely the last thing that I'll mention, which I think it does have a small example of, maybe it was SMS service. If you go into SMS service, that file.
The testing situation.
Yeah, if you ignore the implementation that Kit has here, because there's a little bit of an advanced thing that he's doing here. It can be really useful if you need a separate implementation of something for testing, to just attach that layer as a static property on the effect service class, so that you can have. So if you bring that back, that test layer Kit, in tests now, in production, you can do SMS service.default, whatever. In tests, now you have the ability to just do SMS service.testLayer, right? So it can be sometimes useful to attach these layers as static properties on your service. The only downside with this is that it's not as tree shakeable as having the layer as a variable in your a variable in the module scope. If you attach it, if you attach your layer as a static property in the class, it's much less tree shakeable than having a module scope as a layer. As a
it's like test layer down here or something.
Yeah.
Hopefully, though, test implementations won't bring in a bunch of third-party dependencies, but of course they could, and it depends on your context. Well, cool. Well, that was great. I think, I don't know, I'm not sure if there are any last comments about this pattern, but that's basically what I wanted to go over, at least as part one. And it took, of course, 50 minutes. So I always assume things are going to take 1/8 of the time that they do. So we should probably get to questions, particularly Tyler Earth's question. So yeah, we'll pause there. We can come back to it if there are any late arriving questions about that. And then next time, maybe we can go over how context and the innards of layers work. Yeah. So, Tyler, I'm going to bring you in 3 seconds. 2, 1. Good. Hey, Tyler. Nice to meet you. Welcome. Oh, I cannot hear you.
Not able to display this camera and mic. Oh, no.
Well, that's a lie, because I saw you for half a moment.
Me too.
Oh, no, he's experiencing connectivity issues. Ask them to refresh and re-enter the studio. Could you refresh and re-enter the studio? Let me bring you back. Yeah, try to call in again. I can hide you? I can't even hide you. There, okay, see, second Tyler. All right, and the first one's frozen, so whatever. No!
Memoization failed.
I only see broken Tyler. Let me. I can't kill him.
Can we kick broken Tyler out?
Nope. Broken Tyler's stuck in here. Oh wait, remove. Oh, am I removing the right thing? Yes, maybe. Remove Tyler Earth. Shit.
Off by one Tyler error.
Okay. Old Tyler's dead. New Tyler, try again.
Welcome, new Tyler.
So
Yay!
I
All
think that
right, I
was
can
a
hear you.
Zen browser problem. My bad, guys. I switched over to Chrome real quick.
You've got to use OpenGPT or whatever, ChatGPT Atlas or Dia or Helium browser.
Yeah, Helium. That's the one. How you guys doing? Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you for
Welcome.
being here.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Do you guys have the link that I had pulled up in the original one? If not,
Ooh. Yeah, because it's in like the chat. That chat thing is right because it makes you write some text. I couldn't click on the link in there. Could you post it in the Discord or the live stream chat?
yes, there it is again. All right.
Perfect.
A little bit of context about this project. This is my first sort of effect app after enjoying all the content you guys put out on YouTube and your own channels and things like that. This is more or less me exploring, what are the actual ergonomics of writing it, doing a little bit of exploratory work for hopefully introducing this at work. And we just needed somewhere to start with it. So this is just a webhook on Vercel, just a serverless function. And all it does is takes GitHub requests or GitHub pull request events, and then like updates some statuses in Notion. And then I added just a couple random, things for complexity and learning's sake.
Amazing.
I'm not really expecting like a full code review or anything, but if there's any like high level, stuff that you guys see that is like wrong or weird, of which there is several I'm aware of, and I'm sure maybe not.
I'm going to pull it down and then we'll take a look. And I'm cloning it right now.
Sweet.
Are there any specific questions that you had, Tyler, that you wanted us to like focus on?
That is a good thing to have thought about ahead of time.
That's all good.
No worries.
I think structurally, the GitHub folder within the source is a little funky because it's not like I don't really think I've designed a service per se. I think I've designed kind of a bunch of functions for that one. But
Yeah.
I'd also just be curious to see anything that you guys
Yeah, let's take a look.
It wouldn't be too hard. I'm already poking around the GitHub folder here, and it wouldn't actually be too difficult to literally just take all these methods and pack them into a service if you wanted to do that. Like you could literally just grab all these and pack them into a service, and that would be that. In fact, if you did that, you could lift the other dependencies you're yielding in here out. So, for example, whenever Kit has the ability, he can scroll down maybe to the validate GitHub webhook method.
Oh, which file are you in?
In GitHub, in the GitHub directory, on the left there, GitHub.
Thank you.
In service, and then just scroll down to validate GitHub webhook.
Okay, cool. Validate GitHub webhook. Perfect.
Yeah, so here's a good candidate. Like, basically all of these methods could be lifted into a service if you wanted to. And then, like, the other dependencies that you yield within these methods could be lifted into the service constructor instead. So, for example, like the app config here. Having said that, there's nothing wrong with module level methods if that's like kind of the nice thing about Effect is like, I think we're going to start leaning people into the service pattern because it's the lowest overhead way to make sure that you're not footgunning yourself with services and things like that. But there's also no issue. Like the flexibility of Effect means like if you have an effect that yields a service, it will show up in the type parameter and you'll be forced to provide it at some point. So there's nothing wrong with this file per se. I'm just saying if you wanted to, I don't know, change it, you could lift these into a service and do it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to add on to the other service.ts method or other service.ts files that are in this, I basically tried to do services in a bunch of different ways. These are sort of like one-off just functions. The other one has the tag and layer, and then the other one is just using effect.service.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So layer. So the Notion one is following this sort of tag based pattern.
Yeah.
We could take a look at that, and then there's also which one did the other system info? Maybe okay, a simple one, but nonetheless it works.
Yeah. I actually do
Perfect.
have something from the Notion service that I think would be kind of interesting.
Sure.
Your opinion on. So I added this like dry run functionality to this, but it feels sort of like I've not taken advantage of the ability to just like kind of merge over a layer or something, maybe instead of like intertwining a conditional call within. I'm just curious if that's how you guys would do this, or maybe if you have separately from the Notion service, like an actual Notion client, and you swap out that implementation rather than the individual methods here.
Yeah, I think maybe I can take this one, Kit, and then you can provide your own like bias.
Sure.
I think one thing that I've found useful when I have this quandary of like I have a thing that I need to conditionally change the service implementation based on that thing, whether it's like an environment variable or a CLI flag or something like that. I have found the pattern of what you're doing here, but then if you create an effect that actually returns a layer, right? And the layer that you return is based on that flag. So in this case, let's just say your dry run flag, and this is going to be I'm going to answer this in two parts. The first part is like if you need to swap out the entire implementation. So let's say you have a Notion dry run client and you're going to swap out literally the entire Notion implementation based on that flag. Then you could easily like have an effect that does an if statement on that flag and returns a layer from that effect. That is the dry run Notion client or the live Notion client. And then at the very end of that effect, you would just do a layer.unwrap. And layer.unwrap effect takes a effect that returns a layer and turns that into a layer, right? So that's like a really easy way to sort of swap the implementation. If the implementation of just a single method needs to change, then I think what you're doing here is fine. Just like conditional logic over that. So it really just, it depends. You have some flexibility there. And I think for me, like whenever I do this type of thing, the decision point is more, am I changing the entire implementation of the service? Like, for example, if you have a production or a test, or sorry, a good example that I always use is like telemetry, right? I have an environment variable that I want to use to either enable telemetry or disable it, or a CLI flag. Like I can use that variable to return an empty layer, or I can use that variable to return my production telemetry implementation, and then I just unwrap that effect or the layer from that effect. Does that make sense, Tyler? I think.
Yes, it does. I like those approaches. I'm gonna probably play around with doing some of those here. Also, side note, I think I named this wrong. I'm not sure that this is technically like the live service here.
That's fine. This is more just like whatever. By the way, Kit, useful pattern in TypeScript if you don't want to as any stuff, but you still want that mimics the type. Instead of doing this, do just a declare const. Instead of export const, export declare const and remove the implementation.
Okay, just do this.
And yeah, do it. No, literally like the word declare space const.
Oh. Okay, there you go.
This is kind of like in Zio when you have the triple question mark, or in Scala when you have the triple question mark.
That's good to know. I was looking for something something like that. Undefined as any was working in my code base, but the linter didn't like it here. But this is terser. I declare. It's very southern. Okay. Notion. I'm trying to follow this pattern. I might not be doing it as you specify, but basically, like one might imagine that this live implementation would not match on the dry run and simply do the live run, and then so that would be the actual wet Notion. In contrast, and then if otherwise, Notion. We can check the in this sort of super layer. What's going on? Why is it not letting me else? I'm probably
Because
doing
it's a
something
superfluous. It's a superfluous else. You don't need it.
Oh, because it'll just fall through. Okay, so it's a linting thing, I suppose. Okay, that's fair. And it seems to be very sad. So it's very sad indeed. Probably because I'm missing something.
You just need you need a layered dot unwrap at the end, a pipe to layer dot unwrap.
Okay, so around the final layer, right? So pipe layer
around the effect that's constructing your thingy. Dot pipe
okay,
layer
pipe.
dot unwrap effect.
Huh.
And why is it unhappy now?
It might be. This now the type is wrong, certainly. But no, it's still unhappy. Are we sure it's not after the final one? Oh no. Okay.
Yes, sure. It's not after the final one. Patrick's saying something. Actually, at the top instead of layer dot effect. All right. If anybody sees what we're doing wrong here, let us know.
Unwrap effect.
Nuke the layer dot effect notion. Oh yeah. Get rid of the layer dot unwrap effect at the top and the tag.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, get rid of that and the last parentheses. Yeah, there we go.
Oh.
Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, so I could have just done, all right, so layer dot unwrap effect. Okay. So yeah. So so this is just unwrap effect and we don't need the wrapping. And we don't need to give a tag because that's going to be determined by the layers that we provide. Okay. And so this might fail with the configure and we'll get us a notion. So, okay. So you can have this sort of layer. And if Notion Live or Notion Dry had dependencies, which maybe I'm going to simulate real quick, well, this will never throw in. This needs a string, right? Okay, Notion Prod will need a string. And let's say Notion Live had some dependencies as well. I pulled it into its own file. Can I undo this? Oh, thank God. Okay. Yeah, for some reason, it's not letting me type this, but let me say this requires
a number.
Because it's a configure, and this requires a number. There we go. Then, okay, I've failed again by refactoring too many times. What have I done?
This may not unify, and this is there's a way to fix this, but I don't want to go over it right now.
Oh, it might not work right now. Okay. Oh, interesting.
It's a unification thing, which I think if effect.gen handles unification for effects, but not for layers. So you'd have to.
Oh, that makes sense because it's returning the yeah.
It's a TypeScript thing.
Okay. Well, that's a subtle thing. I wonder. I probably would have to as or satisfies or something. Okay, that would be interesting if we could fix it. I mean, this is a very advanced technique. So the problem is that I was hoping that this would unify. This depends on a string. This depends on a number. Therefore, I was hoping it would figure out that this would depend on a string or a number. But really, it's saying no, this has to be. It found the first one, immortalized that one, and now this one can't fail. So yeah. Maybe anyway, if it's an advanced thing, so we won't worry too much about it. But we should talk about that later, Maxwell. Maybe that's fixable. I don't know. It's an advanced pattern, but nonetheless nice to have. Okay, it works without that crazy manual fakery of alternating dependencies.
You'd have to use the unify module in effect, which is why I don't want to go over it.
Ooh, okay.
That's
I won't.
It's literally a TypeScript hack to make it work, so I don't want to go over it.
Would it be possible to build the layers and just use layer dot from effect and instead of unwrapping them? Or does that have other problems? Like if I do layer dot effect and I do layer dot build?
You won't benefit from... So this actually does have a problem, which is that the scope that's created internally when building a layer will not be propagated to this build. Build will require a scope, which would then have to be provided to this, and you need the notion tag in the layer.scope.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
No, not there. Yeah, there.
Anyway, other issues nonetheless.
There's going to be other problems here besides that. So it's better to use unwrap in situations where you need to swap the layer you want to provide based on some variable.
Okay, but you might have to unify some things. Okay, well, I wonder, is it possible to... Anyway, I'm curiosity, but probably too much of a rabbit hole. I'll think about this later. But anyway, yeah, we have you, Tyler. I won't keep digging into that hole. What else would you like us to talk about? I mean, this looks like a cool code base. It's like you're exploring different patterns. So obviously, if a real code base, probably want to unify in one, but that's not the purpose of it at this moment.
Yeah. I guess maybe the only other sort of major thing here is sort of in the webhook.ts file. It's in the API folder. Yeah. I was just curious if if anything about this stood out as like atypical setup or something. I was using a little bit of unwrap effect to do things like access app config to use them for the tracing layer or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so you are doing a very similar thing here, actually, right? So you're getting the Node SDK trace live. So this particular construction here at the top, or are you doing it a few different times?
I do it a few times. I do it there. I do it for the effect dev tools, which I also have integrated into this repo a bit. Yeah, I was just trying to figure out how exactly do I kind of isolate these layers, get a little bit of app config, and then send them off and use them in the program itself.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is definitely a challenge. It was a challenge in Zio. I don't know. I'm curious your answer, Max, because you'll have you have layers and you have effects. And generally, it's nice if for every layer there is an underlying like .make or something, and maybe there is that the effect the layer just kind of wraps. Maybe there isn't in this case, because then instead of being forced to sort of construct or return the layer here, you can just kind of build a layer out of effects like you would normally. If you want to actually like return or execute some code, like if you're not just using the provide layer combinators, it can get a little weird. But maybe there's no solution to that here. What do you think, Max?
I'm sorry, I don't fully understand the question. Tyler.
Sorry.
I was just going to say it's really just about like, is this the common pattern for if you want to, you're consuming a layer that already exists. It could be this Node SDK layer. It could be, if you scroll further down, there's one for DevTools layer. And I'm just reading from the config each time and then sort of repackaging the layer. Is this the typical setup, I guess? Or, yeah.
Yeah, this is fine. This is fine. Because just trying to think if there's like a shorter hand way to do this. Yeah, I mean, I think this is perfectly fine because app config is only going to be built once, and then you're just going to be reusing pieces of it to determine what the further down layers in your application are doing. I think this is actually a good way of doing things anyways, because when you call like .layer here on devtools.layer, even though this is a method call, because we're unwrapping that layer, it's going to be properly memoized. You could argue that, like, some of this logic, as somebody mentioned in the chat, shouldn't this logic live in app config itself? You could make that argument, but again, that's an architectural decision, not necessarily an effect specific one. Like, you could do whatever you want here. I think this pattern's actually fine. I was actually, instead of looking at the layer stuff, because I think the way you're handling layers in here looks fine to me, I was looking at your handler and your error handling, like all the way down. Handle fail type.
Yeah. This one, I iterated a few times to get here, and that's a great call out. I forgot that this was one of the earlier parts. I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
So yeah, where is this used? Handle fail type. Handle fail type.
In handle exit. In the same file. And that's used probably in the server, right?
Yeah, so here, yeah, so there's a few things we could do to improve this. Like this is if we start with just like the handler itself, the Vercel like handler or whatever, there are patterns for taking these handlers and instead of like capturing the request response object like you have and turning that into a layer, we actually have some pre-built solutions with Effect HTTP that can make this a lot nicer to work with. So for example, like in Effect HTTP, the HTTP app type in Effect HTTP is literally an effect that returns a response. Like the response is like the success value, and the environment type is the request. So you always have access to the request in the environment. You can like access it whenever you want. And the end result of that effect is the response that you want to return to the client. So I can actually share in the chat. I had put together like a really dumb version of a function that I wrote for Vercel a while back. I can share that in the office hours chat after the call. But another thing I want to call out here related to the error handling with handle fail type is when you're doing handle exit, one of the things you could do here is, so all the run syncs to log stuff also like are screaming at me that like this is a problem. But one of the things we could do here to make handle fail type a little bit better is where you check if the cause is a fail type. Before passing the full cause into handle fail type, you could do a cause.squash on the cause, which attempts to give you the most like important quote unquote error that occurred.
Where is this? Sorry, Maxwell. I just want to make sure down here, 280.
Yeah, right there. Before we pass the cause into handle fail type, if you run before that, after that line, but before the next one, insert a line there and do a const error. I don't know, const error equals cause.squash. No, like the module cause.
Yep. No, not cause.
Cause.squash.
Come on, AI.
Come on, Zed. Or cursor, whatever we have here. And this will attempt to try to give us the most important error. Now, is the cause typed as unknown here? Can you hover over cause for me? Interesting.
It's a fail, right? Because we know it's a fail at this point.
Actually, wait. Since it's a fail type, shouldn't it have the error property on cause?
It does.
Can you try to access cause.
Yeah.
So we can actually cause.error should be and if you just hover that type for me, Kit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So we can pass the failure directly into handle fail type, and then in handle fail we can use. You can't do that if cause also contains other errors, right? We could like pass the fail type directly into here and try to match. Like for cause, that's sequential parallel. Yeah, you're right, Tim. Sorry, I'm reading the chat at the same time I'm looking at this. There's definitely a better way to architect this, Tyler, that doesn't involve manually parsing through the exit. And perhaps me sharing the function implementation I wrote. I actually was like working with the Vercel folks to try to give them a zero config deployment solution for Effect HTTP, which we're still working on. But there's like a non-zero config version I wrote, which is very stupid and simple, but it should give you an idea of like how you can still keep the error handling in effect. So you can do like the catch tag stuff instead of matching on the instance. Yeah. Let me actually pull it up. I have it somewhere here.
And I've made a note that we can do just like at the beginning of this session, there was some amount of preparation into talking about layers. We can do that for error handling in the future, because that's definitely a big topic. And we can come up with a non-trivial sort of real example.
Yeah, that's a good call out.
Through. Also, Tim, you should definitely join sometime if you want to. I never know what time it is where you live, and so I assume you're busy or sleeping, or it's like a few years from now. But if you want to join, just let me know. But I appreciate your ghostwriter wisdom. Sorry, Tyler, I think I interrupted you.
No, I was going to say this is great feedback. I'll definitely look at that reference that you mentioned, Maxwell. And if you work out whatever it is you're working out with Vercel, I'm happy to put that in here and try that out in this repo too. My goal with this repo is basically to, this is one I made for something at work. Notion started shaking us down, trying to get us to pay more for AI by putting GitHub integration behind it, behind the paywall. So this served as me researching and actually really successfully paid off with the team when I showed it to them in terms of all the insights we get from the observability and the error handling and stuff, even with my bad implementation of it here. Thank you guys.
I don't think it's bad at all, to be honest. I think it's actually like especially your handling of layers and stuff is pretty good. I think it shows some really nice patterns, and you actually go over a lot of like the major patterns. By the way, this schema right here, I was going to call out and forgot to. Instead of a schema.union of many literals, this could be just schema.literal with all the literals.
Oh, okay. Good to know. I literally didn't write a single line of this file. This was all AI.
Well, good to know that AI does a pretty decent job with the fact, which I mean we already knew, but like I'm glad to hear that that's the case.
Yeah, everything was me trying to get toward really high testability too. So the tests were a huge part of this, including all of the arbitrary make stuff and the sampling. So I've been trying to push further and further into figuring out where I can't test within this very easily. Yeah.
Amazing.
Cool.
Yeah, we've got to talk more about schemas on here too. Oh, sorry, you want to share something?
Yeah, I'll share my screen really quick, as long as I don't do something dumb here. Tyler, this is relevant to web handler layer. This is relevant to what we were discussing just a second ago. Let me make sure I don't share the wrong screen.
Also, Patrick, you should join too sometime if you want to.
Yeah, anybody can join. Let me make this bigger. And let me get rid of the terminal since it's not relevant right now. So I just wanted to show something really quick, which I think is a nice, this kind of goes back to, this is the Vercel function test repository that I was talking about. And it actually uses HTTP layer router and HTTP API, which is again like another higher level on top of HTTP app. So if you want to just use the simple HTTP app, I think that's like a good place to start. But like in effect, we have this HTTP app type, which comes from Effect Platform. And the HTTP app type is literally just an effect that returns an HTTP response, can fail with some type, might have some requirements, but also has the request and its requirements. So any program that or any effect that is a child of this program could do this, yield server request, server request, and then you have access to the actual request here. So instead of like what you were doing where you manually created a layer out of the request and response, you can do this. And then you have access to like the request wherever you want. And what's nice about the HTTP modules in general is you can very easily convert them into a normal web handler. So there's like these two web handler methods. Two web handler is one that means you've like satisfied all of the requirements of your HTTP app except for a scope. There's two web handler layer if you want to pass along a layer with your app. So if we have our like, maybe we'll call this app actually. And then maybe we have a layer that we'd want to pass along, which has all our dependencies in here. Like if we have other stuff in here that we want to pass along, like class my service extends effect.service my service. Don't judge my slow typing here without NeoVim. Oh god. This is what happens when you get too used to Mattia's LSP.
Got to add it to the playground. I'm sure that's trivial.
Oh yeah, that's trivial. Absolutely trivial. And then I need this. If we have like some service that we also access in here, like const my service equals yield, then this type would actually not be right anymore. We'd need to say this app can never fail and requires my service. We don't need to annotate this type. I'm just doing it for example. And we would need to return HTTP server response. I'm just doing this as an example so that people can see like how you could potentially use this. There's still some problem in here. I don't know what it is. But this is kind of the structure of an HTTP app where you'd have like some dependencies you might need. You can access the request coming from wherever you call this handler. Oh, invoke.empty. Thank you, Stephen. And then here you can actually pass along this layer. So default or whatever other layers you needed. I think what's cool about this is like in Vercel, they have the ability for you to pass like in their API, they have like the ability to do this like export fetch handler thingy. So you can literally just do this and it works. And you can also, because they have support for this now, any services that require cleanup, you can actually bind to process dot on SIGINT, right? You can like listen to these and do a dispose to clean things up when the process exits. And what's nice about this is, again, there's literally no manual handling of the request and response here. Like you can handle it however you'd like. The request comes in as a dependency, you return the response as part of your effect, and all of the wiring between like the runtime and the actual handler is handled for you by the HTTP library. Yeah, I just wanted to show this because I think it's like a really easy way. And plus, when you do this, now if you have like some errors that this app could potentially return, like if this becomes like something, instead you can just use normal effects type stuff, like effect.catch tags in here, or you could like, and then you could use this to say like, foo error and return a particular HTTP server response, blah, 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 right? Like you could actually leverage all of the nice effect things to handle this stuff.
This is awesome.
Anyway.
This was one of the first sort of like re-architects that I had to do going into this, was figuring out how to deal with rec and res there, because when I went to go test it, I then was like, oh, now I have to mock all of my requirements and responses, or requests and responses. And this is so much nicer.
Somebody asked, do we have to dispose, or layers not GC'd or something? Morgan, you don't have to dispose. This is just to ensure that your resources are cleaned up properly before the process exits. So like, I don't know, if you have some custom logic that absolutely has to run before the process exits, dispose will make sure that happens. Like this makes sure any resources acquired by your program are properly shut down. But yeah, Tyler, I wanted to show this because I figured it was a nice pattern. It also ties into everything we were talking about services and layers, because a lot of people are building these HTTP integrations and whatnot. So
yeah, this is great. This is very meaty. Give us more as you refactor this. Do come back, Tyler, and we can look at it underway as it becomes even more beautiful.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for looking at it today. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Tyler.
Thank you for hanging out.
Good to meet you. Put a face to the globe,
There was one more question, was when will effect.service be added to effect small? We are working on it. There are a bunch of open questions we still have about effect.service for 4.0 that we want to try to resolve. One of the things that we're seeing if we can figure out a little bit better is like, the typings around my effect.service. We're seeing if we can like improve this whole like constructor thingy over here, this like class pattern. But long story short, there's still a few open questions we have. So yeah.
And I know there was a caller too, Benjamin. I know we took a while, and it's been an hour and 24 minutes. So come back next time if you, or call in again, and we can do it now. But if you're watching this recording and you've already left, do come back, and I'll prioritize you next time. Oh, great. We Gucci. And use Chrome. Yeah, I guess use Chrome. That's a good warning to everyone. I should update the event to give all these qualifications. There was a couple questions as well from Don. Do you guys bother to talk about the role of effect in relation to evaluating model outputs? If we can guarantee runtime safety at compile time, that's already a useful heuristic for semantic safety. It would be a good discussion around how to translate business logic to test implementations. I'm not sure if I fully... My brain just might be mushy and putty as I promised after an hour and a half.
Yeah,
I might need that to be reworded.
I'm not quite sure I'm grokking that one either, but there's another question about, did we cover any OTel stuff today? We did not, but we can. I saw your question, David, in Discord. I just don't think we actually were able to get to any OTel stuff. We talked mostly about services and things like that. And then Ladin Sandpiper, can we ask questions here? Yes, you can ask questions. Could you explain the difference between a scoped and effect on a service? Yes.
Let me bring back my code so we can look at something there.
I'll let Kit explain that one since he's driving the editor.
All right, share.
Also, sneak preview or teaser. In Effect 4.0, there is no scoped versus effect. You'll just be doing effect.
It'll auto-handle it? What if you do want to leak your scopes for some reason?
You should never leak your scopes.
That's probably fair. I guess you could always wrap it somehow in some other class or whatever. But yeah, we should probably spend a session. I'm going to make a note, talk about scopes. It's a powerful and kind of simple concept, but also, let me quickly ramble about scopes in case nobody knows what scopes are in general. You can get a scope. How do I get a scope? So you get a scope whenever you want to have some kind of finalization run. So my scoped effect, and I'm going to say effect.gem and do a little function in here. Not going to do that stuff. We'll console.log hello, and then we'll say goodbye world. And then in the middle, I will use effect.add finalizer. That's probably the simplest thing you can do. And I yield these things. I'm not yielding. And I've not imported anything, probably. Yield. And import. Where's effect? Console. There we go. And why is this sad? Because because it's just going to be the effect in here. Cool. So I'm finalizing. Finalize, whatever. So let's run this program. I guess I have my bun runtime. That's more fun. Let's run my scoped effect, but it's not going to work because let me comment out this down here. My scoped effect requires a scope. So by adding finalizers, we have required a scope. We've added that requirement to our dependency inter-union type there. So we can provide it, of course, pipe. Well, there's a couple ways. One is we can eliminate it by wrapping the effect in, let's do that here for now, pipe effect.scoped. And this will remove the scope. It provides a scope to whatever effect you chain that upon. And so now I can run the program and we can see what this does. So hello world, goodbye world, I'm finalized. So yeah, what happened to the execution order? First it said hello world, then goodbye world, and then this thing in the middle ran last, which you could probably intuit based on its name if you're used to, finally in other languages or defer in some languages. It basically is going to wait until some later point to run the finalizer. Let me do this. Finalizer 1, and then I'm going to add a second finalizer. And I can do this in any order. So I'll run it like this. So hello world, goodbye world. unfinalized 2, and then unfinalized 1. So it ran them sort of in reverse order, these finalizers. So what's happening? A scope you can basically think of as a stack of effects. So it's a stack of effects that can't fail. And a run for side effects. So it's a stack of effect voids. That's really all it is. It's a whatever. And that scope is sort of implicitly here behind the scenes. And every time you add a finalizer, it grabs that scope that's obviously in the environment, pulls it out of the environment, and pushes an effect onto that stack of effects. So we get 1, and then, of course, because it's a stack, we push 2 onto that. When you call effect scoped, all that does is it goes through that list of effects and runs them. Yeah. And there's some other details, we haven't talked about sort of like interruptibility much in these office hours, but in Zio, at least, I believe these are uninterruptible. So it's going to run them to completion, even if the thing has been canceled. And if it fails in here, we're still going to see, so I could say yield effect dot, let's die even, kaboom, and run this program. Oop, does this have to be an error? What have I done here? Oh, return, I guess, but I kind of want to fake it. So that's just a linting error. So I'm going to run this anyway. And we can see that it ran the finalizer. Well, yes, it runs the finalizers at the point of death. So remember, it's dying before running the finalizers, but it's going to ensure that it runs the finalizers. This is kind of the whole point. It's to clean things up. So the scope is really just this stack of effects that are run later on when you close the scope. That's all it does. And so these will percolate upwards, propagate upwards until you sort of scope the thing. Now, there are 2 constructors for layers, layer.scope and layer.effect. So when you do layer.effect, it creates an effect. It creates a layer from a given effect. And let me do it with our app, actually. So I'll go. Maybe I shouldn't delete things. That might be useful again. I'll comment it out. Go back down here. Let's go to our app layer and app layer.default. Oops, app service. So close this. So here I used the effect constructor. And basically, this is going to, under the hood, do something like layer.effect. But there's also layer.scope. Scoped, rather. And this will work because it's going to, even though we don't define a scope, whatever, it's a sort of a subset of what's required. So it'll just provide a scope and we'll never use it. But we can use it if we want to. So in here, I can yield, once again, effect.addFinalizer and just say, I am done with my app service. Good night. And then I'll run this program. And we'll see that it's going to do everything that the program did. And then after the program, this run method was called, actually, it's finally going to say, I'm done with my app service. Good night. So what happens here is this layer, if we could look at appservice.run, where is it? No, appservice.default. It just requires the email service. And what happens is when we provide a layer, like we do here, when we do effect.provide, rather, it's going to acquire all the layers, calling these effects that you pass in the order of acquisition. Right, it's going to first need to construct the user service and the alert service. Then it's going to call this, and then it's going to, of course, add a finalizer to some scope that was provided by the layer, and it won't call that finalizer until basically the effect that you provided everything to, which in this case is our program, has completed. And it can complete successfully, or it can fail, or it can even have a defect and die. And then all of those finalizers will be run. So you can clean up things sort of abstractly per layer, which is very powerful. Like if this opened a bunch of file handles, or if it, incremented some Redis keys for some reason and you wanted to decrement them when you were done, it would ensure that happened. And you can see that this is kind of even disjoint from the run method. It's at the level of the layer itself. So, I could say console.log, yield console.log, I am service. Okay, I'm totally just going crazy with my keyboard right now. There we go. I'm service layer. I'm going to go with that. So of course it says I'm service layer. First, it creates the email provider. Look, it looks like I had a log in that one. And then because that was a dependency of the app service, so it created that first. Then it's creating the service layer. And now that everything's been provided, it's actually going to run our program, which is appservice.run, which is this. It's going to run this. And then when it's done, it's going to shut down each layer, aka run any finalizers, close the scopes that were associated with them, if there were any. And of course, if I do another effect.die, kabooey, and yield this, we're going to see that it still is going to shut down the layer, even though the program that the layer was provided to died. So that's kind of what it is. I've been rambling for a bit, so I'll take a step back. Max, anything to add to that, or were there questions?
Nope. I think that was perfect. And a very excellent explanation of what the scoped variant of these layers does. Basically, I think what it all boils down to, we can actually take one last thing. At the very end here, Kit, where you do an effect.provide, perhaps we can add a little list of things. If you go down to where we effect.provide, there are basically a few things. When we effect.provide something, a layer, right? The first thing that this does is it actually we can actually do that. In fact, go into effect.provide. Let's look at the implementation. And then keep going and go to the internal implementation whenever you find it. There's quite a few. There's quite a few overloads in here.
Oh, TypeScript. As a library author, you pay the cost for all the nice users. Oh, my God, where is it? There it is. There it is.
Okay, now scroll down.
Scroll down more.
Basically,
there we go. Boom.
So if we look at the provide some layer constructor here, if we go to provide some layer, all this does is it first creates a scope, which is what scoped with does here, or I should say it accesses the current scope, because when you actually build. When we effect.provide something, a scope is created for us implicitly. So this effect.scoped with creates us a scope. We then build the layer graph with that scope. So any layers that are in that graph that need a scope get provided that scope. So like any finalizers that the layer needs, that scope kind of gets extended onto that layer. And then we just run the program, which is what's happening there with core.provide some context. When you build a layer, you get back something called a context object, which we didn't really talk about, but it's basically just a map of tags to services. And we just provide that to the program. And when that program finishes, we close that scope. So when you effect.provide a layer, you create a scope, you build the layer graph with that scope, you run the effect, and then you close that scope. And that's literally all that happens with effect.provide. And so, like, when we have these layer the race, basically, like, in Effect 3.0, the decision point between using scoped versus effect with the layer constructors is literally, does my constructor use scoped resources? And if it doesn't, you don't need to use scoped, or you could. In 4.0, that decision, that quandary, that question is taken out of your hands, and it's literally just always effect, and layers provide a scope implicitly. And if you need a scope within your service, you create one for it. So you would, inside the service, like let's say we didn't want the layer scope here, we wanted to manage the scope ourselves, we would literally in that constructor do a yield scope.make and provide it wherever. So
yeah, that's funny. It looks like Mattia did a little clippy and is recommending to change it to scoped here. So most of the time, if you ever do this, which is kind of rare anyway, but if you need to, just use scoped and soon enough forget about it altogether.
Alex has a good question, which Tim answered in the chat. And so did Steven. But what about spawning a child fiber in the background from within a service? And in that case, that's a really good use case for a scoped layer, actually. If you have a layer that you want to spawn a background fiber in as part of the constructor, using fork scoped to create that fiber is a very good idea, so that the lifetime of the fiber that you spawn is attached to the lifetime of that service. This way, you're not leaking fibers, and if your program shuts down, the scope will be closed, which will interrupt that fiber. I think Kit is showing an example here of what I mean, where if
Our app is executing too quickly is the problem. Let me do a little sleep action.
I don't think 100 millis is going to be enough, but
Oh my God, what have I done in 100 millis? 100 seconds? No, 2 seconds. Thank you. I just auto-completed. I'm on fire. It only is doing it once. Oh, because I didn't do repeat. That's what I wanted to do. Effect.forever. Is that a hat? Do we have effect.forever as a hat? That's a nice, inspiring one.
I think standard fork also automatically closes because of the auto supervision. It does, but it
depends, I guess, on where you've provided the layer. Perhaps I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think explicitly tying background fibers to a scope is usually the correct thing to do. But auto supervision, generally speaking, will also make sure your fibers are interrupted properly, but it's not always the case.
I think I saw some talk of fork becoming fork scoped in V4, and
it is. We've already made that change. In 4.0, there is no fork scoped anymore. Effect.fork is automatically tied to a scope, so you have to have a scope. We have a fork child combinator in 4.0, which is the current version. So fork is now fork child. Fork scoped is now fork.
Good times.
Yep.
Well, cool. I mean, I think I've taken some notes once again. I mean, I think these sort of loose questions are great, but I don't think there's enough time to get into all of the details that are necessary. So I think we're going to come back to scopes in the future, maybe with a better worked example. So I made some other notes too. OTel, I want to sort of work through something and prepare something there. Basically everything that people have problems with, the big questions that come up a lot. Let's go through something a little more prepared in the future as well. But yeah, are there some last few questions? I know you have to stream with Tim soon. You're the marathon. I want to give you a little break between. Maybe we can take just a couple more little ones if there are.
Tim's computer's in the hospital, so we're not streaming today.
Oh, wow. You're off the hook. Okay. Okay. Effect Atom. Definitely. We should talk about it. I'd love to talk about Effect Atom. I've been using it a lot lately and it's really cool. So we'll do that. As well. Let me see. Same for stream async scoped. Yeah, basically same for streams. Right? It adds a scope, and you have to call .scoped later on. Though I think stream can do .scope too and handle it.
So yes, scopes in 4. Stream and scopes in a stream embeds the scope internally. And that's becoming more clear in 4.0, like to the end user. And also the async combinators in 4.0 have been renamed to callback, I think, for all the modules.
Cool. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for today. That was very fun. Thank you for calling in, Tyler.earth. It's good to meet you. And hope to see you again soon. And everyone else, sorry, Benjamin, for missing your call. Please call back next week, and I will pick you first. And yeah, I'm going to be streaming for, it's been an hour and 40 minutes now. So I don't know if I could do 3 hours with Teach, but I don't know how they do it. How does the Primogen do it? Something must happen to your brain, or maybe it's just you're built that way. We'll see what happens. But I'm going to be streaming with him at least a little bit and professing the beauty of Effect using this custom bespoke Effect Atom-backed animated WebSocket-powered interactive slideshow animation thing that I've been hacking together in my free time. And hopefully that's a compelling experience, missive to the masses for the first Effect exposure. We'll see what happens.
How many buzzwords can Kit fit into one sentence?
I can keep, piping on dot chaining adjectives.
I'm stealing Mike's jokes now.
Okay, cool.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending today. Kit, if you wouldn't mind sharing the URL you're going to be streaming at tomorrow somewhere, that would be great.
Yeah, I think it's on Teej's Twitch. It alliterates. Teej. You could find him probably just by searching Teej. I don't know his specific handle, but I'll post it in the Discord.
And for those who were asked, I don't remember who asked, I posted both the playground that I quickly hacked together, as well as my little Vercel function test repo thingy in the office hours chat. So,
yeah, I think we're all logged in as the same account, and therefore that's why. Yeah, you'll see. You can never trust who it says is speaking. It's either Max or me, or maybe even Michael or someone else. So, sorry about that. All right, guys. Till next week. Bon voyage. Take care,
cheers,
everybody.